Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 10th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. This week, we are going to be talking about change in phonology and phonological systems. We're first today going to introduce the distinction between the practice of diachronic phonology and synchronic phonology. That is, what differences there are between conducting a synchronic analysis of a phonological system versus describing diachronic changes in that system. And then we'll look at three ways in which phonological systems can be affected diachronically, namely through restructuring of the underlying representations, through changes in the phoneme inventory, or through changes in the rule systems. And we're going to look in particular at an interesting type, which is referred to as rule inversion. So for today, you should have read the 11th chapter of the Hayes textbook, and I suggested an optional reading, an article of Paul Kiparski's. I won't discuss that in any real detail today, but for having some other idea of how phonological rules can spread out and expand their domain of application diachronically, the Kiparski reading is interesting. And next week, we will turn to the topic of abstractness in phonological representations. For those of you following the course at the LMU, this week I will upload the fourth homework assignment, the vierte Übungsaufgabe, and that will be due in a week. This assignment will concern itself with phonological change, so this lecture is particularly important. And the fifth homework assignment will then be made available on July 8th. Okay, before we look at some of the particular ways in which phonological systems may be affected diachronically, let's introduce a few definitions to make sure that we're clear on the distinction between diachrony and synchrony. So just to define our terms here, diachrony means the change in a language over time, or more specifically, across generations of speakers. Remember that we think of language in general as being a psychological entity. We can, and we're interested mainly in describing the grammar of a speaker. So when we see changes in the external realization of language in the world, we're probably talking about internal changes in the grammars of speakers across generations. The term diachrony itself is composed of two components from ancient Greek. The preposition here used as a sort of prefix, dia, meaning through, and the noun chronos, time. So diachrony refers to through time, whereas in contrast, synchrony contains a different prefix, syn, meaning together. So at the same time, if we just think of this in English terms, it means now at this point in time. So when we describe, say, present day English, present day German, present day Mandarin, we're talking about a synchronic snapshot of the language, a picture of the language as it occurs at one point in time. And when we come to describing changes diachronically, you'll notice that the way in which so-called sound changes look fairly similar to the way in which we represent synchronic phonological rules, but there are some important distinctions here. So when we represent a sound change, I'll usually represent this in phonetic brackets to indicate just that what we are talking about is some change in the realization of a sound. That is, a sound at one point in time is realized in one way and realized differently at a later point in time. Notice also that we use a different symbol, the greater than sign, for showing this change over time. This means from going from an earlier point in time to a later point in time. The asterisk here, which may be indicated, which may be given here, would indicate that we are dealing with a reconstructed state of a language. One can also diachronically use the underline, represent the slashes Though in this case, we are representing specifically that we are talking about a phonemic change, whereas a sound change may be due to either a change in the phonemic inventory diachronically, or a change in the rule systems diachronically. So it's somewhat more neutral in terms of exactly what has changed diachronically if we represent a sound change in square brackets. Synchronically, of course, with phonological rules, we are dealing with derivations from underlying representations to surface forms mediated by the application of some phonological rules. So we have an underlying representation given in slashes and a surface form, a surface phonetic form given in square brackets. So we can contrast these two different types of rules, if we want to call them that, in the following way. So a sound change refers to a historical event where we see in the overall community observed in aggregate. So we're talking about, say, groups of German speakers, groups of English speakers, groups of Latin speakers, if we look farther back in time. We're looking at what is happening in a community at large and seeing how words on the whole are pronounced. Whereas when we talk about phonological rules synchronically, recall that from our early lectures, we have said that we are talking about some kind of cognitive entity that is part of the speaker's mind, some rule that is embedded in their brain. And we can see these phonological rules only indirectly by examining the speech of an individual or groups of people, and sometimes we can carry out psycholinguistic tests like WOD tests, which we've discussed, and making inferences, building up theories based on our observations. So it's a concrete, unproblematic description to say, for instance, that in one stage of a language, we have a word, say, I'll invent a word, tata, in a language at stage A, which comes later at stage B to be pronounced as ada. This would be a description of the way in which the language is used in the community, and we would seem to have assuming that we have the language directly attested in these two stages, A and B, we could directly see the change of this sound, this voiceless coronal stop, to a voiced coronal stop. And without more data, we don't know the precise conditions under which this sound change has occurred, but it at least is adequate descriptively to say diachronically there has been this sound change. We don't know in language A or language B, because we only have this one data point, what the psychological status of any phonological rules that might somehow relate to these coronal stops or relate to this observable concrete sound change may be. Our first topic is going to concern the restructuring of phonological underlying representations, and here we're going to first see how phonological variation probably plays some role diachronically. It's for precisely this reason that I included an additional lecture on phonological variation. So we have the notion that rules may not always be absolute or categorical, but may sometimes apply with different rates of application. So we'll take an example from the textbook here to illustrate a first case of the restructuring of underlying representations. This involves a case from Old English, where in the sort of later phases of the Old English period, that is in the first centuries of the past millennium, the language had a phonemic distinction between a voiceless lateral approximant and a voiced lateral approximant. So the voiced lateral approximant would be the normal sound that we hear in English words like life and leak, here given with their Old English pronunciations, which were the vowels in particular were somewhat different. But words which today in present day English have this same sound, this voiced lateral approximant, la, were voiceless. So we had loaf, for instance, laugh for the word for loaf, German Leib, for instance. And so we can describe the phonological system of Old English at this period as follows, looking at this set of examples. We have some near minimal pairs we can see in the data. For instance, the word for lid contrasting with the word for life. These look fairly similar. Simply the voiceless lateral approximant was realized as a voiceless lateral approximant, and the voiced lateral approximant was realized as a voiced lateral approximant, quite simply. But at some point, we could say that Old English developed the phonological rule given here of lateral voicing, whereby a voiceless lateral approximant could be realized as a voiced lateral approximant. So that underlying sound could be realized in a slightly different way. And as the textbook does, sometimes we could say that this rule was optional. Speakers could realize the voiceless lateral approximant phoneme either as a voiceless or as a voiced sound. Let's think for a minute what seems perhaps a little odd about this rule. So there's something that this rule is lacking that we normally see in the synchronic phonological rules that we write. So specifically, it seems we're lacking the information after the slash that tells us in what context the rule should have been applied. So normally we add a slash in our rules and it says that in some context, some set of preceding sounds or following sounds, this rule was applied. But instead, this rule lacks an environment that tells us where it should or should not be applied. This means that the rule could potentially apply to any voiceless lateral approximant, regardless of its exact phonological context. That is, this rule is what we could call a context-free rule. And in synchronic phonological systems, these rules, when they are not as categorical rules, probably don't exist. That is, all rules that are context-free like this are probably optional rules, rules that can allow for differences in pronunciation of the same sound without any conditioning environment. So once this rule of lateral voicing was established in Old English, then we have the phonological system will look a bit different. So the voiceless lateral approximant phoneme now has two allophones, the voiceless and the voiced lateral approximant, whereas the voiced lateral approximant can only be realized in one way. So that's what this diagram means. The one phoneme now has two realizations, and the other, the voiced lateral approximant, still only has one possible allophone. Now, what we can imagine in terms of, this is where the connection to variation comes into play. And specifically, we could imagine that the rule, the optional rule, came to be applied more and more frequently. So let's imagine that that optional here initially means that the rule was applied 50% of the time. And in a subsequent stage, the rule was acquired such that it would be applied more frequently. And in the third generation of speakers, most speakers came to acquire the rule as having a very high rate of application, such that the underlying voiceless lateral approximant would be realized as a voiced lateral approximant in virtually all cases, or most of the time, the vast majority of the time, 95% of the time. And so we can rewrite the rule exactly as I've done here. We specify the rule as having a 95% rate of application. And at all of these, in all of these stages where we have this optional rule with some specified rate of application, potentially all of these lexical items here on the left side, words for loaf, loud, laughter, and so on, would have exhibited token variation. That is the word, let's use the word for loaf as our example. And let's underlying representation and add a period in which once this optional rule of lateral voicing was available, the diacritic here isn't in such a good position. There, that looks better. This form would have had these two different possible realizations, and we would have seen token variation. And the reason why, if we think back to the electron variation, the reason why we say we would have token variation is because the variation depends upon the optionality of the rule and not some features specified to the lexical items themselves. Now, if we imagine then that, say, a child growing up in an environment in which this rule of lateral voicing was applied 95% of the time, and the child heard 95% of the tokens of the word for loud, lud, with a voiced lateral approximant, and only 5% of the time with hood, a voiceless lateral approximant, maybe it could be possible at that point that the child would no longer notice or take seriously the evidence of a voiceless lateral approximant. Maybe the child could assume that those could be speech errors, simply noise in the data. And therefore, the child comes to the decision at that point that this word, lud, loud, must simply have a voiced lateral approximant. If the child acts as though it has always heard a voiced lateral approximant, then the child might simply conclude, well, if I have heard the word lud with a voiced lateral approximant 100% of the time in all cases, then I should posit an underlying representation. That is, I have no reason to believe that the underlying representation for this lexeme is anything other than simply lud with a voiced lateral approximant. So the underlying representation is going to be somewhat different. If we go back to the period before the process of lateral voicing, the optional process of lateral voicing existed in the language whatsoever, we now see a change in underlying representations. So initially, at some earlier phase, we can call it stage A, the underlying representation for the word for loud had a voiceless lateral approximant, but at a later stage, let's call this stage B, this same lexical item now has a voiced lateral approximant. And we can represent, if we want to simply neutrally reflect what has happened between Old English and a later phase of the English language, we can write this as a sound change, as I indicated here, with the forms given in brackets, in square brackets, where the voiceless lateral approximant becomes a voiced lateral approximant. But in this particular case, there's also some impact on the phonemic system, I think. That is, the child's the child's phoneme system. Once the child thinks that it is hearing a voiced lateral approximant all the time, the voiceless lateral approximant phoneme is simply going to disappear from the language. So the phonemic inventory of English will be changed such that now there is simply a voiced lateral approximant, which is always realized as a voiced lateral approximant. The child has no reason to think that it is or has heard anything different. So in a real sense, it would also be correct to say that there was a phonemic change whereby all instances of the underlying phoneme with a voiceless lateral approximant have changed into an underlying voiced lateral approximant. So we can imagine that there was a gradual change in behavior diachronically, whereby it was more and more likely that any given voiceless lateral approximant would be realized as a voiced lateral approximant. So the change happening gradually over generations here has to do with the rate of application of this optional rule of lateral voicing. But once learners come to the conclusion that they are not hearing any instances of voiceless lateral approximants, then there is a sudden and dramatic change in the grammar. Suddenly, learners acquire grammars without any underlying voiceless lateral approximants whatsoever, and they no longer also need this rule of lateral voicing. If they think there are no instances of underlying voiceless lateral approximants, they don't need this rule in order to explain cases in which words that have, to explain words that can have both a voiceless lateral approximant and a voiced lateral approximant. And this sudden shift in the grammar and lexicon we call restructuring. And we'll define restructuring here as a systematic change in the underlying representations of a new generation based on the surface forms of an older generation. So to summarize what has happened here, it looks like in the case of Old English, all instances of surface voiced lateral approximants, la, were derived from underlying la. And so the restructuring of the underlying representations of the individual lexemes, the restructuring of all of these items to have an underlying voiced lateral approximant, so to have la and lud rather than la and hood with voiceless lateral approximants, means that there would be a phonemic loss, a loss of the phoneme of the voiceless lateral approximant. Or sometimes another term that you may find used would be the merger of the two phonemes. That is the, as this phonemicization diagram in the earlier period somewhat reflects, these two phonemes shared this allophone, but diachronically, then these two phonemes have merged in this single allophone, and both the voiceless phoneme and the allophone with a voiceless lateral approximant disappear from the language, diachronically speaking. Okay, now that we've seen this first instance of English, this first instance of a sound change and restructuring of underlying representations, as well as the loss of a phoneme and ultimately the loss of a rule, because of course, once the underlying representations are changed and the phoneme of the voiceless lateral approximant is no longer needed, the rule of lateral voicing is no longer needed in the language either. So now that we've seen this first example, we can take a short break and then we'll sort of summarize what happens and move on to seeing another case study.